our channel Trailhead Ranger NJ, and in our previous series we have covered some of the real-time based scenarios of Apex triggers. And even while working on LWCs or anything, you might have heard from other people or me saying that we are using Apex code best practices, or these are the best practices for Apex trigger, Apex classes. So, what exactly is the Apex code best practices which we should use in Salesforce while working on the Apex triggers or Apex class, and why should we use it? And these are some of the questions which you might be getting in interview as well, like what are the Apex some of the Apex best code practices, and why do you use this one? So we'll be covering all those the best practices, and with each point we'll be covering that why we use a particular point. So these are very easy, just you need to understand some few wordings. So let's get started. Our first is bulkify Apex code. So this is the most common and most important best practice we should use while working on triggers or even Apex class, that we shall have our code bulkified. So what does bulkify mean? As its name suggests, that is bulk. It should able to cover many number of records at a time. So the first principle is to write the code for multiple records at a time, and we should write scalable code and avoid hitting the governor limit. So what does it mean? That is, whenever we are writing a query or maybe a functionality where we are checking for something or even performing any operation, so we should have our code configured in such manner that it is not only covering one record at a time, but it is covering number of records at a time. It should be able to cover uh, suppose 200 records at a time instead of one or two records only at a time, so that it will avoid hitting governor limit as well. Even the CPU heap size will be left. So that's why we should have our Apex code always bulkified. Now we'll be understanding with an example. So suppose if we are using a hard-coded index in the code such as x0, that we are only fetching 0 element or first element of an array, and then we are checking for something, that means the code will only work for the single record or the first record, but it should be able to work for multiple records. So we should have our code configured in such manner. So let's move on to the second point, that is avoid SOQL and DML inside for loop. So whenever you are writing a code and if you are using for loop in your code, so you should not have your SOQL query inside that loop, or even perform any DML operations such as insert, update, delete, or any operation inside that loop. We should configure the code in such manner that we are having our SOQL query outside the for loop, and even the DML operation should be performing outside of the for loop. So that's what it is saying, that do not place SOQL or DML operation such as insert, update, delete, undelete statements inside a loop. When these operations are placed inside a for loop, database operations are invoked once per iteration of the loop, and making it very easy to reach these SFDC governor limits. So you can understand, right? So if we are suppose having an insert operation inside the for loop, and our for loop is configured to run for 10 times, so whenever it will be like whenever it will be running for those 10 times, the DML operation, that is that insert operation, will be running 10 times also. So then it can cause the issue, and will we could have problem, and our SFDC governor limit could hit. So what do we do to avoid it? We just store the IDs of all the records on which we need to perform the operation, and then outside of the for loop we will add it to a list and then perform operation to the list. You can find it in our one of the triggers video. or later on we'll cover in another videos as well. Next is querying large data sets. So in Salesforce we have governance governance limit that SQL queries can return 50,000 of records. So if we are working on the large data sets and that exceed the heap size limit, so the SQL query for loop must be used. So how we can use the SQL query in for loop? So here's the example that whenever we are trying to use the query, either you can define the query on top in a variable and then can use the variable, or you can just directly in for loop use the query here if we want to query over the large data sets. Now let's move on. Use of map of standard objects. So there are some complicated scenarios in which we need to use the map, where we need to get the value of records from different standard object based on the looped standard object records. So like suppose you are working on two object standard objects, where one of the standard object is related to the other one, so you can use the map by storing its the parent one's id, and as a value in map you can store the other standard objects record. So in that cases we can use the map, and we can use map of standard objects to get the values and even avoid the SQL queried in for loop as well. So now next, what are the other best Apex code practices? We can use of the usage of the limits Apex method. We can use Apex limits method to avoid hitting Salesforce governor limits. So there are help documents of Salesforce where you can find the different governor limits of Apexes. So you can check those out and you can keep that in mind while working on the Apex classes or triggers. So many of us face governor limit while working on the triggers classes or test classes. Even few of the governor limit errors are as too many SQL queries when SQL query limit is hit, or DML rows 10,001, or too many query rows 50,001. So these are some of the errors which occurs. Now let's move on to the next Apex code best practices, such as avoid hard coding IDs. So sometimes, as earlier also we had mentioned that if we are specifying the index, then we are making the code to work on single record, not on the multiple record. But that was not hard coded, as in like we are trying to make the code work for only particular record. Like there is a record exist in our Salesforce org, and we have fetched that ID, and we are given that ID. No, we are not doing that. What we were doing there is, suppose we are having 5 records. So in that list of 5 records, we were trying to work on only first record, that is which will be fetching first. But here what they are meaning is, if we are specifying a particular records id, that you need to work on this record id only, or you need to work on this record only which is present in the system, then you should avoid that. So deploying Apex code between sandbox and production may fail if we are using if we are using hard coded IDs, because ID may not be the same for putting the record type ID or even record ID or anything in the other org. So that's why we should avoid it. Now the next one is use database methods while doing DML operation. So you might be aware that there are some database methods such as, even for DML operations, such as database.insert, database.update. So we can use those methods for performing the DML operation. An Apex transaction represents a set of operations executed as a single unit. All DML operations in a transaction are completed successfully, or even if an error occurs in one operation, the entire transaction is rolled back and no data is committed to the database. So if we use normal DML operations such as insert, update, delete or undelete, then if we are performing operation on 200 records and suppose 198 records are processed successfully, but at the 199th record there is some error occurred, so it will roll back the changes for all the 200 records back to the normal and will not perform any operation. But while using the database methods, what happen if in the same scenario of 200 records, 198 has been processed successfully, and at the 199th we are having an error, then it will save the 198 records as it is with the DML operation performed on it, but on the 199th it will throw an error, and there the functioning will stop. So database methods in Apex allows us to generate a save point. That's a point where in the request that specifies the state of the database at that point, so it will it will save our midpoint in the database. So that's why we should try to use database methods as well wherever it's required. Next is use asynchronous Apex. So you might be aware of asynchronous Apex such as batch Apex, queue Apex, using a future method or schedule Apex. If you are not aware, then don't worry, we'll cover that in detail in later videos as well. So if you are aware of it, so while working on the Apex class, you can return within an asynchronous method and get its own independent set of higher governor limits. Asynchronous Apexes are having higher governor limits. If I'll give you an example of batch Apex, so it is having high limits, and even if it divide large data set into the chunks of 200 records and perform all operation on batches of 200 records. Another example here is the number of SQL queries doubles from 100 to 200 when using asynchronous. If we are using synchronous Apex, the normal Apex class, it will allow us to perform SQL queries only 100. But while working on the asynchronous Apex, it will allow us to perform 200 SQL queries. And even the total heap size and maximum CPU time are larger for asynchronous call. So we can use asynchronous Apex there as well. Next is exception handling in Apex code. So exception handling is nothing but if the error occurs, then what should happen. So if we are not handling the error properly, it will stop our code and close it, or like end it abruptly. But if we are handling the error, at least it will throw the error properly, and it will not the end functionality abruptly. So we should always use DML statements, return runtime exceptions if something goes wrong in the database during the execution of the DML operation, and we should catch those exceptions. We can use try catch blocks for exception handling. In try block we can write our normal code, but in catch blocks we can catch the exceptions. Then how to display that error as well. With Apex we can write code that responds to specific exceptions as well. Like in API cases, if we are having specific exceptions such as based on the status code, we can throw different errors as well. Next is write one trigger per object per event. So if when we write trigger, so there are maybe different scenarios which need to be performed on one particular object as well, one particular object only. So it is suggested that we should write one trigger per object only. That's why Apex triggers within Salesforce are designed to help you automate certain tasks that we already have seen. We have done 10 triggers videos, and Apex triggers allow you to perform custom actions before and after events in Salesforce. Those are nothing but, in short, before saving the record to the database and after the record has been already saved to the database. Then next is while writing Apex trigger, you should follow the best practice and create one trigger per object only. So yeah, so thank you, I hope you understand something. We have covered Apex code best practices very briefly, but it will give you a gist that what are the Apex code best practices. If in an interview there is a question that what are the Apex code best practices, what is the main one, or if they might ask you what is the bulkifying your code means, or what are the database method, then you will have at least some idea now, and you can give those answers. And also please keep in mind, I'm also a learner with you. If I'm making any mistake, please let me know in the comment section. I'll definitely improve on it, work upon it. So yes, thank you. And if you like the video, please like it, subscribe the channel, and let me know in the comment section how you are finding my videos. And if you have any topic in mind you want me to cover related to Salesforce, please let me know that as well. And thank you, stay tuned.